Hey everybody, it's Magic. We're going to start the show today. No intro. Nobody else is here, so we're going to start the show just as is with me as your host, going over a couple things that have been brought to my attention this week. Primarily, a couple site mail questions that have come in. So we're not going to focus on the forum that much, but we will be discussing some things that folks have asked about. One of the big issues that I'm having is just remembering to do what I'm supposed to do as a coach to manage my team. And I know we've talked about this in the past, but unfortunately, it's a situation where as you get older, the more you play this game, the more you think you've got the hang of it, the more complacent you get. And that's what I found myself doing is I've become quite complacent. In that regard, let's go ahead and get in depth on that. I've said it before, game plan, then your playbook, and you should be good to go. And what do I mean by that? Well, just a couple days ago, I happened to be in the playoff game, and I thought for sure that everything was good to go. I had just come off playing, I think, 4 sims in a row. So my latest playbook was the one I used for sims. And my game plan indicated that I was using that particular offensive playbook. So for sims, everything was good to go. Unfortunately, when it came time to prepare for the playoff game, I had done my homework, analyzed my opponent, knew what I wanted to do to combat his offense and to exploit his defense. So I went about setting my playbooks. Defensive playbook, squared away. Offensive playbook, squared away. Went to bed. You got it. I got up the next day and checked the halftime score, and sure enough, I was trailing. And for the life of me, couldn't figure out why. Looked at the game plan, and it was set for my sims. So it had my sim playbook as the one being used for that game. So all the work I had done for the offensive playbook and the defensive playbook were null and void just because I didn't do that one thing, and that is ensure my game plan reflected the playbook that I intended to use. And like I said, I've said it 100 times, game plan and playbook. You've got to make sure that you have both of those set to the way you want. And what I always preach is open your game plan first, select the playbook rather that you want to use, and then edit that playbook to the way you want to be able to set it up. If you do it in that way, you've identified your game plan first and foremost being the playbook that you want to edit, and that drives you to edit that playbook. Unlike what I did, which was backwards, which was set up my playbook, and then lo and behold, never even adjusted the game plan. For you old hats and you veterans, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's had that happen to them where you think you do one thing, but you actually don't. For the new guys and gals, understand that it sounds simple and it sounds like a no-brainer, but when veterans who've been playing this game for real life 15 plus years make those kind of mistakes, then it's important enough to bring it to your attention and to beat it in your brain. Game plan first, then you do your individual playbook. That sounds kind of bass-ackwards, but the whole purpose is to make sure that you've got everything set up the way you want it set up. Okay, enough about that. Let's get to the question that was asked about potential and work ethic. Somebody site mailed me and said, I thought I had it figured out. Now I'm confused, and I really don't understand. I think I'm overanalyzing. I think I've got them backwards. What am I missing? This has often been debated on the forums, and we've talked about it quite a bit on this show. One of the more important things to understand is that the two don't necessarily go hand in hand. And a lot of people believe that potential and work ethic feed off each other. Well, in a way that's true, but not in a way that a lot of people think. And I'll explain it by using an example. Imagine that potential is a bucket. And by filling that bucket with water, you are fulfilling that potential. The max potential that a player can play or grow to is a full bucket. So we've got that understood. The work ethic part is how fast that bucket fills. So your work ethic is time and your potential is quality. So work ethic and quality, or work ethic and potential, that time and that quality do work hand in hand in some regards, but the one that's really a factor and important is that work ethic identifies how fast, remember we're talking about time, how fast that bucket fills up. And the other aspect of that is a lot of people don't realize that as freshmen and sophomore, they tend to fill up a little faster and then start to fill up a little slower even after work ethic grows. So that's what I'm trying to say when the two don't go hand in hand necessarily. Let's use that same bucket ideology and water being the fulfillment of that player's potential. Let's say that you have a water hose that you're using to fill that bucket up. And for the first, let's say 3 seconds of time that water comes out of that water hose is the freshman year. And then the next 2 seconds, sophomore, the next on, you get the picture. Now imagine that you've got a nozzle on that water hose. You turn it on max at the faucet. Nothing's coming out yet. Now you've got your bucket. When you first engage that nozzle, that freshman year, that water pours out of there fast. It pours out of there as fast as that work potential or that work ethic says it's supposed to fill that bucket up with that potential. And you've all seen it. You've all done it, I'm sure. You've got the nozzle off. The water is max. The first time you press that trigger, there's a huge amount of force that pushes that water out. And that's akin to how players grow based on their work ethic in their first year. It's a rush. Boom, you'll see a lot of growth. But then as that water pressure stabilizes in that hose, so do players stabilize with their work ethic, even though they are growing. Now imagine that you hadn't turned that water on all the way. You've just turned it on, let's say 75% of the way. Even with that, the pressure builds up so that when you first hit that nozzle, there's a max water rush into that bucket. Then you turn the faucet on even more. So let's say that you're in the junior year, your work ethic has grown. You've got a little more water, but it's still not as much as that first initial rush. So to clarify again, potential is the amount of water in that bucket. Max potential, of course, is a full bucket. Work ethic is the amount of water coming into that bucket in a given period of time. So the more work ethic you got, the faster that bucket fills. The more potential a player is, the more water goes into that bucket. And let's spin this backwards and give an example of a low potential player with a very high work ethic. That bucket may be a 5-gallon bucket. A low potential player may only be a gallon of potential. He may have, let's say, 75 or 80 work ethic. So when you turn that water on, he's going to get that immediate rush, but shortly thereafter, he's got that steady flow. He's going to be at his potential in a matter of 2, maybe even the early part of his 3rd year. But again, that potential is low. So because he had a high work ethic, drove him to reach his potential that much sooner. Now, as far as work ethic affecting potential and making the potential grow, that doesn't happen. And I've had a question about that. For instance, a player that comes out, the scouting report, with an average work potential, regardless of where his work ethic is, and I'm sorry, I may have confused you with that, with his potential, regardless of where his work ethic is, that potential won't increase above or beyond what was identified in the scouting report. So even though you have an average potential scout and you have a work ethic of 99, you won't see his potential go into the high range. it will stay as an average. His potential is his potential. The amount of work he does just identifies how soon he reaches that particular potential that he's been identified in his scouting report. So hopefully I didn't confuse anybody. If I did, you'll just have to play this back and take notes and tell me where I'm wrong. If you have a dissenting viewpoint, I'd love to hear it because it educates me and then I get a chance to educate others. And from what I understand and from what I've experienced, the way I've just explained it, although it may be a bit contrived or convoluted, is the way that the game works. So if you have any questions on that, like I said, don't hesitate to holler at me. Here's one of the things. Let's see. This question came up from Wiredon, and he says for practice, he's heard 15 or 20 minutes per formation, but he's also read some old threads. And for D2, he sees that the recommendation of 8 to 12 minutes with putting the remainder in the individual minutes. Okay, this is one of the things that I really had a hard time understanding early on when I was playing. So I understand how people are confused with this because there's nothing clear cut that comes right out and says, if you do X, you will get Y. If you do Z, you will get A. There's nothing that comes out and says this. So through experience, a lot of what you read on the forums is just that experience from other players. The coaches have determined based on their own trial and error what results arrive from what input. So if you're only putting in 2 minutes of team practice, then yeah, the formation IQ won't grow as fast as if you're putting in 5 or 10, 15 or 20. Now, this is, I say this with a given of everything being equal. Of course, formation IQ changes depending on the individual's GPA, the amount of time you put into practice, where the individual started as a freshman with his formation IQ. Is he now a senior? So a lot of variables come in but from a generic, just basic foundational element, practice time develops your formation IQ. It's important to develop your formation IQ because that is how you help reduce your fumbles, you increase your execution, and it also increases the results when it comes to your special teams. Your special team practice helps with eliminating those long kickoff or punt returns or greatly reducing them. On the flip side, it also helps you get more yardage in your punt return teams or your kickoff return teams. And I also expect that it helps quite a bit on your special teams when you're talking about field goals. Maybe the accuracy improves. I haven't done the necessary studies for that, but that's what I have been told. So your team practice helps in that regard. Individual practice helps build those cores that are identified in those position roles. And if you go to your coaches tab, I believe it is, your position roles, you can identify at D2 and above what value you place on certain cores for certain positions. So those values that you have identified or those cores you have identified, those are the ones that will increase when you assign individual practice times for those cores in the practice tab. So they're almost the same in regards to layout, but they're different in regards to how you want the players to perform. For instance, if you've got a running back at a speed of 70 and you're trying to increase his speed, well, that's where you would put your effort in your agility, I believe it is. And that amount of effort will help that particular one. And there is on the forum a thread that identifies what cores improve given what practice settings. And forgive me, I didn't look it up prior to this show. I didn't realize I was going to get into it that deep, but that is available. So I encourage you to look. If you can't find it, holler at me on site mail and I'll dig it up and get it for you. But as far as how much time, this is where what division you're in my opinion, is a determinant. Because, for instance, at D3, the players are pretty much, I'm trying to be political, they pretty much suck in regards to the players at D1. So given that the players are at a floor level, they're all pretty much the same, they tend to grow more with practice, individual practice, because they've got room to grow. With D3 at the team level, your team is your team is your team as far as what it can and can't do. Granted, your individual practice is more important at D3 because you want the players to be better. And I'll get into that more when we talk about D1. So at the D3 level, if you want to eliminate your fumbles, if you want to help reduce the fumbles, increase your special teams performance, you want to put in some practice time, but not as much as you would put in at other levels for team. So at D3, you've got a team practice that is, at D3, I usually use, I think it's 5 to 7 minutes on one defense, one offense, and my special teams. The rest of the time I dump into my players, because when those guys are seniors, I want them to be D2 caliber players. And the only way they're going to become D2 caliber players is improving their core attributes. And the only way to improve their core attributes is through practice, individual practice. So that's why I take that route. At D2, I generally move my team practice up a notch to 8 to 10 minutes, which, drops the individual playing time, because again, they're better than D3 players. And there's a larger gap between really good players and sucky players at D2. And if you've done a great job of recruiting and you've gotten some of those upper echelon players, you're already ahead of the power curve against your opponents who didn't do a good job recruiting. So you don't necessarily need those players to grow that much, but you do want them to execute a lot better than you would if you didn't put in any team practice. So I'd bump mine up to about 8 to 10 minutes roughly, and the rest on individual players. Now, when we get to D1 AA, D1 AA is an animal of a different kind, simply because you never know the quality of player that you're going to get recruiting at D1 AA. And the reason that is, you've got the D1 teams who periodically will drop down and sign some of those high caliber D1 AA players. So as a coach, you really have to set your practice time after your recruiting season based on the quality of players that you have gotten. If you got a really good recruiting class and some really top-notch players, those guys in a year or two will be the cream of the crop. So you don't really need them to grow all that much. So you can have the luxury of spending more time in team practice and developing those execution abilities, focusing those field goals on special teams. So your defense and your offense and your special team will benefit more in the long run by a good recruiting class, not just because of the quality of player, but because you have more time to put into team practice than you would individual practice had you gotten a bad recruiting class. And now you need these players to grow. You need them to elevate their course just to be competitive. And you take your hits in the team practice. Now, D1, that's where I use very little individual practice. Because here again, especially if you're at an elite, it's expected that you're going to sign players that are, again, the cream of the crop for D1A. And an elite will sign a lot of players whose cores are practically maxed out in some regard. The big difference between the players at D1A are the secondary cores that come into a particular position. So you may not focus your practice time on the primary cores for a particular position, but you practice more your secondary cores at a position, and you take much more time on team practice, because at that point, everybody that you're facing in the upper echelons of D1A, if you've got a competitive team, pretty much equal level when it comes to talent on the teams. There'll be some disparity, some variances, but for the most part, it'll be a lot closer in range from the top team to the number 20 team or the number 30 team. So the difference can be made in your practice on your team practice, increasing that formation IQ, increasing that execution, because that's where you'll see the difference on the field, where a coach who has top quality players is spending 5-10 minutes on team practice and dumping all the rest on his individual players. Those players aren't going to grow very much. They can't. They're already topped out for the most part. So essentially, he's wasting practice time on the players that he could be putting on team. And you'll see this on the field if you do the opposite, which is less focus on your players and more focus on the team. You'll notice that he fumbles a lot more. He has a lot more penalties. He misses a lot more kicks. Things just don't go his way on the field for execution purposes. A lot shorter runs. Missed passes, things of that nature come back to bite you when you don't practice team at the upper levels of D1A, for instance. So hopefully we have ironed that out and not confused too many people with it. I know it can be convoluted at times, but when you stop and think about it and you put pen to paper and you draw out your plan and what your goals are, figure out what it's going to take to get to those goals. You know, the perfect world, we'd be able to increase our players and our team with 180 minutes each, but it just doesn't work that way. So unfortunately, that's where a lot of differences come in between the coaches, not just their scheme on offense and defense, but in how they set up their team regarding practice and regarding where they put those practice minutes. And again, it's not necessarily the same way every time. It depends on the class you got. It depends on who you have coming up and where you want them to improve. For instance, if you've got a defensive tackle who's got a 90 technique with a 90 strength and a 90 tackling, why are you practicing 20 minutes on tackling, strength, and technique? He's about maxed out. Use that time on team performance and team practice. Get those IQs up, make that team better all around. Well, folks, I know this has been a short show. It's about 30 minutes, which is usually about the halfway point for us. But as I said, tonight we have no panelists. We did not have anybody come on. What we did want to do is provide you guys a little bit of insight into how work ethic and potential balance each other, work off of each other, and remind everybody about setting their game plans and working on their playbooks. So really appreciate y'all tuning in and enjoy the feedback and the kudos I get. It means a lot. And again, come back and join us. We'll be here next Thursday, and the plan is to have some guests come on that maybe will educate me in the process as well. So from Magic to everybody out there, thank you for tuning in. This has been This, That, and the Other. Come back and join us next time.